The graveyard at Knockbreda Parish Church saw its first burial in 1763. It became the last resting place for many famous and many ordinary people of all creeds and classes, and a trip through the peaceful gravestones and memorials tells a tale of the history of the Belfast area and the people who lived there. Our guides are Primrose Wilson from the Follies Trust and, first of all, Norman Wetherall.
Knockbreda graveyard became quite a prestigious place in which to be buried. Just about every level of society and every profession, trade, whatever, is represented by the people who are buried there. The parish owns only that part of the graveyard within the wall. The rest has been transferred to Castlereagh Council. If you come to the graveyard, probably the first things that you'll be noticing will be the mausolea. There are two really spectacular ones and a third one which is on a more modest scale. The big ones are Waddell Cunningham's 1797 and Thomas Gregg 1796, and all three have recently been restored by the Follies Trust.
They're probably one of the most interesting group of architectural and very fine mausolea in Ulster, and we discovered at the conclusion of the work that in fact they were by the hand of Roger Mulholland, who's a well-known 18th century architect who was working in Belfast.
Obviously Waddell Cunningham and his brother-in-law Thomas Gregg feature very largely simply because of the scale of the monuments that were erected over their remains. The Rainey family is another one. But Sir Charles Lanyon, for example, the most significant architect in Belfast in the middle of the 19th century, chose to be buried there, although he lived in fact away out to the other side of the town on the north side. Shipboy McAdam of the Soho Ironworks and the Ulster Journal of Archaeology and the preservation really and revival of the Irish language in the late 19th century is also buried there, the various members of the family with him, and other industrial family, Grimshaw for example, Coates of the old Lagan Ironworks. They built the first iron ship actually to float in the Lagan. Grave recently tidied up by some Glentoran supporters, I think, because his house was called Glentoran.
Waddell Cunningham was larger than life. He travelled all around the world, which in the 18th century can't have been terribly easy. And, you know, he was interesting and different, and certainly in death as in life, he clearly was quite a man.
His funeral took place at night. This was a social custom. The higher up the social scale you were, the later the evening apparently you had. He was in the volunteers, a military affair, and so therefore there was a turnout of yeoman cavalry to accompany the hearse from his house in Hercules Lane, now the top of Royal Avenue, out to Newton Breda. They had burning torches, swords shining, this kind of thing, a great military display.
Well, Thomas Gregg was very much his partner. They were colleagues, friends, brothers-in-law, and they got involved in shipping.
Two of them made a huge amount of money by trading in America. They owned a plantation in the West Indies in Dominica, which, appropriately enough, I suppose, they called Belfast. They were also slave owners because the plantation was staffed by slave owners. It seemed to have worked that Gregg, for a time, worked in Belfast while Waddell Cunningham was in America, but the two actually went there together. They returned to Belfast sometime in the 1760s after the 7 Years' War. They'd made a lot of money. Waddell Cunningham, of course, and Gregg were slave owners. And Waddell Cunningham wanted to bring Belfast into the slave trading. And in 1784, he brought up a proposal for have a ship from Belfast fitted out to take part in the Atlantic slave trade. And people were invited to subscribe. Now, he met with opposition there, and the most important opponent was Thomas McCabe, who was a Belfast jeweller, goldsmith, and also in the linen industry. And according to a letter which Dr. Drennan wrote to his sister, Mrs. McTeer, in 1806. Many years later, obviously, McCabe expressed his opposition so strongly. He said, "May God eternally damn the soul of the man who subscribes the first guinea." And the scheme came to nothing.
Among the graves in Knockbreda are those of an industrialist and great supporter of the Irish language, Shipboy McAdam, and the man who built some of the most iconic sites in Northern Ireland today, Sir Charles Lanyon.
Where do you start with Lanyon? I mean, he was, well, first of all, he was an engineer, and then he was an architect. And I mean, as an engineer, he was responsible for the North Coast Road, which must have been one of the most amazing structures and things that were built in Northern Ireland in about the 1840s, 1850s. And when you think of those sheer drops down to the sea and the fact that they managed to build a coast road along there, it's wonderful. He was obviously responsible for Queen's and a lot of other buildings in Belfast. But he's also Lord Mayor of Belfast several times. So he was involved in local politics. And very much a revered man in architectural circles and in political circles as well.
Robert Shipboy McAdam is the most famous member probably of his family. They ran the Soho Iron Works. He lived in a house in College Square East, facing Inst. The house is long gone, but there's a blue and white plaque up on the wall recording the fact that he lived there. Perhaps his legacy really is in connection with the Irish language, when he compiled a dictionary of the Irish language. And he also revived the Ulster Journal of Archaeology, which is a very significant publication.
In 1798, Ireland was rocked by a rebellion of the United Irishmen. There were battles locally at Saintfield and Ballynahinch. The rebel cause split communities and families, and Presbyterians in particular were affected.
Both sides, actually, in the events of 1798 are represented in Knockbreda Cemetery. Henry Hazlitt was one. He was a shipbroker, an original member of the Society of United Irishmen, and a Presbyterian. In fact, actually, the Presbyterian element in the United Irishmen in the North is extremely significant. And then there was William Sims, who was also a United Irishman. He and Wolfe Tone and Samuel Neilson met with some others at MacArt's Fort in 1795, a celebrated meeting at which they vowed not to rest until they had brought English rule in Ireland to an end. Now, on the government side, you have John Brown. His family is remembered today by Brown Square in Belfast off the Shankill Road. And he is greatly recorded on a wall memorial belonging to the Lyons family in the cemetery. He was in England at the time of the outbreak of the 1798 rebellion, but he hurried home to travelling Port Patrick to Donaghadee. When he arrived in Donaghadee, he was taken prisoner by the insurgents. However, he was able to escape because the insurgents shortly afterward were defeated at Ballynahinch. I would recommend spending a little time wandering around the cemetery, looking at the gravestones, because many significant people in the history of Belfast are buried there. Professionals like Lanyon, businessmen, people who built up Belfast. And of course there were other people who were less significant perhaps. The earliest tombstone is dated to 1763. It's a memorial to Elizabeth, the wife of Daniel Rowntree. She died aged 38. My favourite, perhaps, memorial among the humbler folk is one erected by Elizabeth Clark in memory of her father-in-law, her husband. She kept a little pub in Hammond's Court. Today, Hammond's Court is Castle Arcade. And clearly, she was rather proud of herself, I think, but it grandly states Elizabeth Clark, Hammond Court.
You can visit the graveyard at any time. The church is normally closed and has a range of services every Sunday. If you come by car, please park in the car park on the south side of the church off Purdy's Lane.